Looks like a lot of people care about social housing, right? Good evening, and welcome to this Architecture on Stage event, which is one event in a programme of lectures and debates curated by the Architecture Foundation in partnership with the Barbican Centre. My name's Bennie. I've designed housing, I've developed housing whilst at Peabody, and I now support the public sector to develop even better housing. So I'm also a bit of a professional housing nerd, having written and spoken about housing to a variety of audiences over the years. 9 years ago, 2015, wasn't life different then? I travelled around mainland Europe by train, and I visited 70 housing schemes and spoke to city planners and architects along the way. And the really, really key takeaway I had from that trip was that the basic level of state and city investment in housing is much higher over there. Public investment in housing in Europe is seen as an investment in essential infrastructure, like education or health, that we do better on over here. And it's been nearly 45 years since we've invested properly in housing in the UK, and that's where this evening's story begins. So first of all, I'm just going to show you what public expenditure there is annually on affordable housing, both new and existing, in this country. That's me. Right. So I'm not going to linger on this slide, but suffice to say that the little sort of greeny blob on the left is capital expenditure of about, 5 billion in housing every year. The great big blue blob on the right is 25 billion of housing benefit. In that capital expenditure, you've got 0.2 billion on decarbonising our existing homes, and you've got 2.5 billion grant for new homes. There's something wrong with that picture, and I'll let our speakers develop some of those thoughts. So now I'd like you to imagine we're 1 year on. It's January 2025. The new housing minister is now in the cabinet and has argued successfully for an enhanced budget. And that minister's receptive to myriad great ideas about how to tackle the various housing crises, but they can probably only prioritise 2 or 3. And before I introduce all of our speakers over there to go through their ideas, I'm just going to drop you some London and UK housing stats as food for thought. London's homeless. 1.6% of London's households are homeless or in temporary accommodation, and 80,000 of those people in those households are children. London's mid-market stock. So what I mean is not social housing, not for sale or private rent, but the middle bit. Only 1.6% of homes in London are for that mid-market. In Vienna, there's about 35% of those. I think that's quite interesting. Home ownership, that is the average first-time buyer deposit. Anybody got that? Who's a first-time buyer in here? No. So all of those 4 things, what they lead to is that 42% of people's income, if they're renting privately, is spent on their rent. And 40% of those private renting households are actually on housing benefit. So they're paying a shed load to live somewhere, but actually the taxpayer is funding quite a lot of that as well. Getting angry yet? London's new build. 90% of what we build new in London now is flats. In a way, nothing wrong with that. 1 in 7 of those flats is in a 20-plus story tower. Okay for some, probably not for others to discuss. Here's the real killer, and I've only got a couple more after this. 33,000 homes is what we now deliver annually as affordable homes in the UK. 260,000 a year is what we delivered in the 50s. There's all kinds of reasons for that. It's mostly about money, but again, the speakers are going to touch on some of this. Retrofit in London, progress required to get to our 2050 target of retrofitting all the existing homes, 3.7 million homes in London. you need to finish retrofitting one home every minute to reach that target. And that's the kind of 3 to 4 billion is the kind of money you'll spend. And my final slide is that London's office space is 10% vacant at the moment. That's a lot of space. It's normally at around 5, and interestingly, New York is at 20. So, in summary, I'd say there are 3 public housing aims that we need to aim at right now. More of it, fairer, and better. Those 3 things are going to come up all the time tonight. So our 8 speakers this evening, actually it's 9, 10. I kept having to update the script, are going to pitch to you and the Minister for their proposition to be prioritised. And it may be that their ideas actually don't need any more money. They're more about culture change or policy change. Here's my plea to you. There's about 1,000 of you here. I need you to ask questions and be really challenging at the end, please. Tell us your own idea if none of what people say floats your boat, and drop your understandable inhibition about saying something stupid in front of 1,000 people, and just say it anyway. So our speakers break roughly into 4 groups, and I would call them the who, the where, the what, and the how of public housing delivery. And what we're going to do is start with 3 speakers talking about who. They're going to talk about local councils, council housing, and other things from their own perspectives. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Pooja Agrawal, who's Chief Exec at Public Practice, which places architects into local councils across England. Thank you, Pooja.
Over the last few decades, we have seen housing become a huge political background for the community, for developers, for architects, and for planners. Blame is pointed at each one of these groups as if somehow each of them is the problem and the key barrier to housing. If we really want to radically address the housing crisis, we need to start by changing the way we talk about housing. Let's not blame the community. This NIMBY culture has grown for a number of different reasons. The most toxic one, in my opinion, is the link of lack of social housing and immigration. This narrative has been going on for as long as I've been in this country, which is 20 years. This is not a new narrative. This NIMBY versus YIMBY debate is boring. Let's not blame the architects. Architects are increasingly pigeonholed as the masters of aesthetics, and this being their only function, or should I say form. Blaming architects for some of the failures of modernism is not helpful. We need to move on from the heritage versus modernism debate. Let's not blame the developers. Developers and investors need certainty. And let's be honest, this is one thing we have not experienced for a long time now. We have had something like 24 housing ministers in 24 years, 6 in 2023. I met 4 of you, maybe 5, I lose track. We need political stability to enable economic stability. And finally, for anyone who knows me, this is my favorite. Let's not blame the planners. The infamous comment that came in 2011 by Eric Pickles, that planning was a drag anchor on growth, was the beginning of the barrage of attacks we have seen on public planners ever since. When really the key issue has been the lack of funding in planning teams. Local authority funding on planning has fallen by 43% since 2020, and up to 62% in the Northeast. That's levelling up for you. A third of the officers who did Public Practice's recruitment and skills survey last year are planning to leave the public sector in the next 2 years. Key themes that emerge from our survey is beyond funding, there's issues of lack of skills in the market, the use of agency staff, and the increased negative targeting of officers on social media. This has contributed to a really, really low morale of planners in the sector. It's time for a reset. I believe intervention needs to happen at the level of local government to really address the scale of housing we need to deliver. In its best form, and believe me, I know that's not always the case, but in its best form, local government represents the communities it serves. It knows its places, it knows its people, it knows its businesses. It has the tools and system, whether it's land or procurement, to make change from within, but it also should have the opportunity to take a longer-term view. But to get there, we urgently need to fund local government. We need to tackle the dire strait local government is in. And this is not because of incompetence. There's huge amounts of pressures post-austerity from an aging population and also the impact of COVID. We're seeing local authorities going bankrupt by the day, and this is hugely challenging, and this is a really difficult situation we are in. At the same time, however, we do need to devolve power to local authorities to give them that opportunity to impact the places they know best and the people they know best. The Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill has expanded on devolution framework, and a number of these are in process, which is really positive, but they're complex and they take time and resource. And we need to address the planning system. We need to fund it, resource it, and simplify it. We need to shift towards more strategic planning and tackle the backlog that planners are currently facing. Almost 90% of local authorities surveyed through the RTPI's recent survey are struggling with the backlog of planning enforcement cases, and over 75% of local authorities will have an out-of-date local plan of housing delivery by 2025, which is maybe this year, sorry. But I think there's hope, so let's hope. I feel proud of the change public practice is making in local government and bringing more people with different skills, architects, engineers, sustainability experts, town planners, into local authorities, many of whom are working on housing regeneration and retrofitting. In the last 6 years, starting from London, we've placed over 300 people. Almost 80% of those people have continued to work in the public sector about 3 years after they started. We're reversing this trend of people leaving the public sector and trying to improve and support that morale that we see is so diminished by growing a community of practice. These people inspire me, and the people who they work with, the teams, the public sector officers that I've met inspire me, and I see you here today. They want to make changes from within the system, and no matter how small the change they make and they perceive they make, collectively, they're making a difference in the way local authority teams are working. So let's stop blaming each other. Let's root for local government. Let's root for people. Let's work together to change the way we think about housing, the way we do housing, but also how we talk about housing. Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce Adam Khan, who's founding director of Adam Khan Architects, which has designed and built new housing both here and in Germany and Denmark. Thanks, Adam.
Hi. Well, this is quite daunting, not just because there's a lot of you, but because housing is such a fantastically complex, difficult, but really fascinating and rewarding kind of place to work in. And I can't possibly do it justice in 7 minutes, but I'm going to just focus on sketching in really crude terms how to potentially to leverage the generational problem as it's seen as a set of opportunities and solutions, and what that might mean for the scale and type of development that we should be concentrating and resourcing. So there's absolutely a crisis in housing, a crisis of delivery and affordability, as Claire's kind of made really clear, and it's probably even worse than you think. Many of the exemplar schemes winning awards were commissioned years ago, and it's actually getting even more difficult to do those now. The current mode of delivering social housing even then was a struggle, but now it's getting even difficult to make schemes viable at all. And anyway, that model had been pushing heights and densities in a way that I'd say is risky and unsustainable. So we're all familiar with the UK generational divide, and that's typically characterised as baby boomers with housing security and capital, whilst younger generations can't get housing. It's an important social economic phenomenon, and it's more nuanced than that, as many older people don't have capital, and actually there's a concentration of housing assets in private landlords as a result of the absolute disaster of right to buy. But there's a clear generational unfairness that is often kind of trivialized by boomers themselves and the boomer press. Anyway, we're all living longer, and we want to live with independence, but the current building stock across, whether you've got capital or not really, across the different wealth bands, is typically unsuitable. It's difficult to heat and maintain. It's difficult to access, get upstairs. It's difficult to provide care in, and it's terrible on carbon, and it's often very lonely. On the other hand, there's a younger generation of families or older people without capital or migrants facing a crisis of affordability and availability of the housing. They can't afford a mortgage, and likely they couldn't even get a mortgage in the first place because of the precarity of their work, and can't even get to the front of the queue to get an overpriced flat from a rip-off landlord. There's no rent control here in London, which is amazing. Even in New York, they have rent control. Now, we know those things vividly, but perhaps underneath lies an even more important issue of a lack of opportunity for initiative and homemaking, and the sense of an opportunity for an active kind of collective citizenship. Now, adults in the late 20th century, if you're around then, had more opportunities right across the spectrum. Even lower income families were able to buy a house, like my parents. There's the classic kind of middle class buying of a fixer-upper of a house, sanding the floorboards, making a family home. There was a council flat with long-term security and a garden, possibly to make it nice. And if you didn't have any of those, the chance to squat houses. So I'll just move on. Here's Bonington Square, empty, redundant housing stock, and an amazing chance for me as a 20-year-old who was homeless to pour energy and care, love into a place, fix the house up, and be part of establishing an amazing kind of vibrant community. And lots of chances for kind of expressiveness, for collective kind of living, alternatives to property, different attitudes to that, for making collective kind of shared facilities, a cafe and a shop. And perhaps I'm being kind of romantic about that, but it has, that place has grown into a wonderful established community. And anyway, nowadays, those opportunities are not there. And so there's this huge kind of frustration, a huge resource of initiative, sweat, desire to experiment that is blocked and with no outlet. That's such a waste of resource. So we have this massive poor housing stock that needs retrofitting. And the problem is that it's fiddly and labour intensive. And the incentives that have tried to date haven't been really taken up. They don't really understand how those incentives might actually play out in real life. So that could be an opportunity for that huge pent-up reserve of energy and desire for homemaking that we just talked about. And so we need a massive societal transfer of assets, but more importantly, of opportunity. That needs big levers of finance, economics, and politics, however that happens. Now, there are some wonderful recent projects of elderly living which give hope that being old might actually be all right. This is the Almshouse by Witherford Watson Mann, recently completed, and boy, it's just amazingly beautiful. Yeah, gives me even hope that being old could be okay. And of course, there's May's lovely Morden College that won Sterling Prize this year. So some really fantastic examples that maybe could attract, could be attractive enough to could tempt boomers out of their cold and lonely houses. And although these are built from kind of well-endowed charities, they do show the standard that we should be aiming for everyone. So when we think where we should be targeting resource and where we should be building, it's here that we do need to do projects at collective scale to get the good access facilities, to be comfortable, energy efficient, to deliver care efficiently, and to tackle the killer disease of loneliness. Now, sometimes older people want to stay in the homes and place they have lived for a long time. This is Ellebo, a housing estate in Copenhagen that we worked on for the last 10 years. It was built in the 60s in a different era of kind of municipal collectivity and family life. Here it is in its heyday. But now it's damp and cold and difficult to access. But it was until the recent project. But the need to improve these basics can be an opportunity for more radical transformation. New winter gardens, opening up the flat interiors to double aspect, breaking open the mute facade into a sociable threshold, and bringing a new kind of permanence and dignity. So this is it's flat. Now, much of the retrofit will be unglamorous, but actually there will be opportunities where a bigger kind of scale of ambition of transformation could be achieved. But if we're going to make tax incentives and tax breaks and funding to make this transformation and to enable this huge scope for active renovation, it needs to be done in a way that breaks the link between housing and speculation. For otherwise, the incentives will just be swallowed up by the market. Now, there are well-tried structures for decoupling housing from speculation. We've heard of council flats. We know of those. That really only works if you end the right to buy. We've heard of co-ops, and we've just seen in Bonington Square a kind of non-equity co-op that was set up there and has functioned really well. And there's really interesting new models of community land trusts, and I think we're going to hear from one of those later, about different models of ownership and equity sharing. And actually there's really good work putting kind of economic basis on the need for good housing. So as architects, we can talk about the kind of qualitative aspects and why that's really important of housing. But for instance, work done led by John McCaslin and UCL, looking at the Affordable and Social Housing Initiative, really to put an economic base on why good housing works, because of the money you save on not just housing benefits, but social care and health. So that transformation architecturally might take many forms. It could be small co-ops renovating a few houses at a time. It could be shell flats, either retrofit or new, as being pioneered really well in kind of Belgium at the moment. It could be adaptability, and we're going to see a really nice, there's a nice example of the House for Artists by Apparata. Or it could be a kind of sense of custom build. So this is a project from Hamburg. There's a new terrace of houses and flats for a co-op of around 30 members. And the idea is it's got a standard chassis which allows individual customization, but an efficient base build. So this is the kind of different varied permutations on that. Some people wanted a double height space, blah, blah, blah. So the key moves really are to move housing from speculation to infrastructure, housing as infrastructure, to move from viability to livability, and to move from the consumer to the active citizen. And it is tempting, in the face of the difficulties of housing, to solve the crisis by trying to build high, dense, and cheap. Indeed, the current model pushes it this way. And there's a rash of big developments precipitated by being near a station, whether it's Woolwich, Vauxhall, Lewisham, you name it. They're huge. And I see them as perilously fragile. They're based on investors, investor-based, and actually, as it happens, the flats are often empty as investors leave them empty to protect their value. And they just use them as a way to park kind of money. And what a waste of resource and investment that is. It's a really carbon-hungry way of having a bank. And that precious investment is serving no social good. So there's a really poor functioning market. And those spaces, those huge, huge developments, are clearly not really livable. And as the newness fades and as the expensive repairs kick in, the places will deteriorate rapidly. They will no longer be aspirational, leaving only those with no choice to rent there. In other words, there's a danger that they are the slums of the future. When we work with communities to develop housing, people we work with know this and are very clear about it. They don't buy the marketing or delusional spin of art developers and their architects. But planners are unempowered to battle against it, and councils face this as the only way to deliver the meagre percentage of affordable homes they bring. And we've been here before, industrial scale, badly built housing with poor public realm and social infrastructure. And we should know that this is costly, socially, environmentally, and economically. So we need a really different model for financing and delivering public housing. And some of you may say that's wishful thinking, and it's all unviable, there's no magic money tree, blah, blah, blah. But actually, a lot of what we need is already there. It just needs moving around. A lot of the housing stock is there, but it's kind of rubbish and it's underoccupied. There's capital out there, but it's locked up in the baby boomers, or it's wasted by investors. And there's energy enthusiasm, but frustrated, blocked, and going to waste. So, my advice to you, the Minister, would be build excellent elderly accommodation, new or retrofit, allow initiative for homemaking and carbon transformation, but decoupled from the market, and build small and mid-scale as good civic neighbours and for long-term livability. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adam. Our third speaker on the public sphere, and I can guarantee this will be an interesting talk, will be Joseph Henry, who's a designer, urbanist and curator and currently a fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Joe.
Okay, good evening, everyone. First of all, it's great to be home. I wrote it's nice to see all your lovely faces, but I wrote that before I saw you, so I'm glad it turned out to be true. I want to quickly just talk about how I see architecture to give context to what I'm about to say. So I believe that architecture at large is a social movement, and that contributes to the public realm. And the public realm is a habitat for social practices, which is where I get to the idea of reconstructing the public. It feels to me at the moment we're living in a non-public age, and you can see this degradation of our public realm everywhere you look, from rising homelessness to crumbling public services, local authorities declaring bankruptcy, and I can tell you in my new home in the USA, it's even more stark. Which is why I've become interested in this idea of reconceptualizing, reconstructing, and redelivering public infrastructure in the public realm. To me, it's a failure of the public that we are still building housing as a commodity rather than as infrastructure. And I wonder if we thought about housing as infrastructure, we could think about what else does societies and communities need when delivering that infrastructure. I'm also wary of speaking about the housing crisis as a crisis, as if there hasn't been some design or causality for this. But if you follow the work of the journalist Vicky Spratt, you see that the people who are affected by this are definitely living in a crisis or a social emergency. And I really think that idea of like social emergency and social engagement will bring urgency to this debate. So is actually the project of public housing a project of reconstructing the public realm? And why is the public the focus of my attention? Because I believe it's the role of the public at large to deliver this, and we all have a role to play. And if we all have a role to play, then as architects, the question is, what is our role? Not just how do we solve this on our own. We need to reimagine the public, I believe, to achieve this. In the words of Professor Tony Griffin at Harvard, we need to think of methods to create a just city justly. And I think this can only be achieved by working with the public at large. I'm also inspired by the work of the economist Mariana Mazzucato, who's also interested in the role of the public. And in her book, she talks about the idea, in the entrepreneurial state, she talks about her desire to see the reconstructed public. But within that sort of entrepreneurial state, who is the public being entrepreneurial to? Who is it being entrepreneurial for, and with whom? Because I do believe that a lot of the ideas I hear around housing ultimately end up with the same people making the same money, with the same profit margins, and they're not really disrupting the systems of inequality. And I do believe that architects have a massive role to play in supporting this work. We know that beautiful architecture is important, but we also know that the space that we create is important for the everyday rituals, which is where people bring together like community and social interaction. And in other words, I believe that architects have an important role in working directly with residents and people to reimagine these communities. And I'm calling this the creation of relational architecture. So about creating the spaces where people will relate to each other, spaces for convening. And I think this is also the role that architects can play in carving out space in a national debate like housing. I've seen in Boston an architecture practice called DS4I, who have set up a social emergency response center within their design gym, providing much needed space for the community to come together in Dorchester, South Boston, to discuss issues such as gentrification, public health, the nighttime economy, or more recently, the war in Israel and Gaza. As Bell Hooks writes in her book, Art on My Mind, she writes about the role of imagination in fostering a sense of liberation. She says, poverty could not be viewed as a circumstance that suppresses creativity and possibly for all around you were expressions and unique sensibility. Standardized housing brought with it a sense that to be poor meant that we were powerless and unable to transform it, to intervene or transform it. And it as she goes on to say, in many areas of the rural South, the shack remains a dwelling that counters and subverts the message of this dehumanization of the spatial imagination of folks who weren't materially privileged. And to me, this is an observation about the public. She says, and I repeat, standardized housing brought with it a sense that to be poor meant that one was powerless, unable to intervene or to transform in any way one's relationship to space. The ability to intervene and transform. So for me, there's an ability to motivate the public to imagine collectively the alternative is such a critical part for us all to play. And I think that I am optimistic that the people in this room understand how to design housing, not like the one that Bell Hooks describes, but as a way of creating this relational space for public imagination. And I also believe that we can't keep looking back on the 1950s and 40s and the 70s of like mass housing as the way to go. I think we need to develop our own generation's notion of what the public is. For example, I see the role of devolution to metro mayors as a moment for optimism. To me, it's the first step in reimagining the public as a space to redistribute power and democracy. For me, right now, is the most important project. But where political responsibility needs to be matched with the revenue-generating powers of America's cities. People don't realize that the Mayor of London is only responsible for administering 7% of the budget allocated on public services in London. We're the most centrally governed nation in Europe. Or post-Europe, depending on your political perspectives. But I think we also need to look outwards and not just backwards. I don't think any one geography has a totality of answers. And I'm also shocked, having spent some time in the US, how internalized their public debate is, and I really think that restricts their ability to solve problems. So public urgency. So I'll finish my pitch with the most important ingredient required for action. To me, that's urgency. And for me, reconstructing the public is the most urgent of projects, because without it, we aren't getting anywhere. The Auditor General of the National Audit Office partly blames our crumbling infrastructure and inefficient capital programs on the governance problem at Whitehall. To me, a failure of the public. Suggesting that mega projects that we are trying to deliver in the country are too large and risky to be managed by the relevant departments in government. This is a terrible indictment of where we find ourselves as the public. And this public inadequacy has real-life consequences. This government is currently spending $108 billion a year on debt repayments, about $9 billion a month. Calculations by Capital Economics, commissioned by the charity Shelter, suggest that the cost of building 1.3 million council houses would be somewhere between $10 billion and $5 billion per year for 20 years. So a month to 1 year of debt repayments over 20 years. Much less than the current cost of servicing our public inadequacy. And this will require sacrifice. I have a tutor at Harvard called Tanya Bagheera, a really amazing Cuban artist. And she thinks if you want to do social change, you have to decide what skin have you got in the game. and especially those who own homes amongst us. If we flood the market with new affordable homes, your asset won't be worth as much as it is now. And are you willing to put that in the game? As I said, we all have a role to play, which is why I come back to the need to reconstruct the public, as I hope this will generate an alternative to what we have now. I don't know what that is, but I think we can all work together on it. And I hope it will engineer a spirit of generosity to pursue a new conception of the public, and this is something that we can all do together. Thank you.
That's a really interesting call to arms. Thank you, Joe. Now we're on to the question of where. And we're going to hear from an architect whose really careful research into land I really admire, Russell Curtis, who is also the founding director of RCKA.
Thanks, Claire. So many people here. I thought you'll be at home watching the Traitors final. So yeah, we're going to learn a lot tonight about the problems and perhaps some solutions to housing. But one of those, as Claire said, is maybe where do we put this stuff? Well, I have some ideas. I bet you didn't think you could see that tonight. But there's a US link for a bit of a glimpse of home, perhaps, Joe. Golf courses. There are 95 golf courses in the Greater London area. 95. Together, that is an area larger than the whole of Brent. If you take, a lot of those are privately owned, a lot of those are publicly owned. If you look at just the courses that are owned by the London boroughs themselves, that's an area the same size as Hammersmith and Fulham. It's a ridiculous amount of space. And I would argue that that's not a particularly equitable use of public space when we're in the face of such a profound crisis. One golfer, there's no red hat on that one, but it's one golfer effectively occupies this same amount of space as 380 people if that land was converted to housing. Putting another way, this is Hyde Park. If Hyde Park was converted into a golf course, you could fit about 100 people on it at any one time. It's insane. I live in North London, and I am surrounded by golf courses. This is one of the reasons that I embarked upon this golf journey. And we took a look at Enfield. And Enfield, it used to have 7 golf courses, 4 of which are owned by the council. Now there's 6 in total, 3 owned by the council. Well, I'm going to focus on Enfield Golf Course itself. This sits right in the middle of the borough. It's owned by the council itself. And Enfield is nearly 39 hectares, and the club pays £13,500 a year rent to the council, which is about the same as a 1-bedroom flat. And I think we don't really appreciate how big these things are. There may be some golfers here, so perhaps you do. But that's Wembley Stadium. Wembley Stadium could comfortably fit inside the. In fact, you could fit several Wembley Stadiums inside this golf course, or the Barbican complex, where we are tonight. Now, is this a good use of public land? I don't think so. So we came up with an idea a while ago of taking this course and say, well, let's do a speculative master plan. Now, some of you might have seen this a few weeks ago in Raoul Moore's lecture. But we did a master plan, a deliberately provocative master plan for this course. Now, this takes the golf course itself, puts housing close to the accessible part of the town, so where it's close to public transport. We've introduced biodiverse wetlands down the middle, 650 homes, new cycle links, walking routes through and across the middle of the course. You have to remember there's two schools next to this place, and neither of them get to the station. They have to go all the way around to get to the station. It blocks off a huge area of land. So anyway, so this whole scheme here delivers 650 homes, biodiversity net gain, urban greening factor improvements, and there's still 9 holes. And you can design these things in a way that you can throw out on the 9 and come back on the 9 and still have 18 holes. So make of that what you will. And you might say you're a golfer. Well, where else can I play? Well, there are 75 more courses within 5 kilometres of Greater London and nearly 300 within 25 kilometres. So, we are not short of golf courses, of places for people to play. And if you put all this together, I reckon this is public land alone, publicly owned golf courses. There's somewhere in the region of 120,000 homes that could be built on public land around London at the moment. And again, biodiversity net gain. This is not concreting over green landscapes. In the scheme that I showed you, we're not losing any trees. All the housing is placed on the fairways and the putting greens. So all of the trees and the wildlife around is protected. 120,000 homes, more than 120,000 homes. That's something like a quarter of the 10-year London Plan housing target. We can do it. We have 120,000 households in temporary accommodation at the moment. Not building this stuff is a choice. It's a choice that we're making not to build homes for the people that need them, and we have to do better. Thank you very much.
I thought you'd all enjoy that. So, the next 3 speakers are going to be dealing a bit more with what. Should our investment focus actually be quality and sustainability of old and new stock? And to talk about these issues, I'd first like to introduce Astrid Smitham, who's co-founder of Apparata, who won the Neve Brown Award for Housing and were Sterling shortlisters in 2023. Thanks, Astrid.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk specifically about the design of apartment buildings. Apartments, because out of the homes we're going to build, the majority will be apartments. And design, because it gets ignored when we're talking about a housing shortage. So last year, the National Housing Summit took place in September. There were over 100 speakers, housing providers, politicians, journalists, experts on topics like mental health, and there wasn't one architect among the speakers. And that's very telling about where design sits in the discussion. Maybe the assumption is that right now things are so bad that any roof is better than no roof, or that where we are is good enough. But what the majority of new build homes are not good enough. This is on build quality, loneliness and how that relates to the built environment, overheating in new homes and how badly that impacts people's lives, space planning and how that impacts people's lives and their mental health and how they feel they can use their homes, and life safety. And we're told that the solution is maybe BIM or MMC, but it's never actually addressing what is being BIMmed or who's doing it. And according to REBA in 2018, only 6% of homes in the UK were designed by architects. And maybe that's a problem. So the absence of design needs to be recognized as a public health issue. So I'm going to talk about just one design issue and what we might be able to do about it, and that's double-loaded corridors. Over the last 4 decades, one apartment building typology has emerged as dominant, and that's the housing block that's fed by an artificially ventilated windowless corridor that then feeds onto more corridors. And it's based very closely on just one of the diagrams in the approved documents. And why is this typology bad? It contributes to at least 2 major problems: overheating and social isolation. It goes hand in hand with single-aspect apartments that can't be ventilated properly, and with services-laden corridors that overheat in their own right, leading to life-endangering situations. The typology is so bad that a whole new part of the regulations has had to be introduced. But the problem goes beyond that. I'm sure a lot of us have been in these kinds of spaces. They're hostile and stifling, uninviting, antisocial. You're not allowed to use them for practical things like leaving a buggy outside. You have no sense of ownership over them, and the more corners and doors, the more disorientating they get. And that's your interface with your neighbours and the world. This report, commissioned by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, recommends the provision of well-designed shared spaces to alleviate loneliness, both through formal and informal encounters. And in my view, the best place for connections is a place where you already share the space. That's the circulation area. And the protections that we currently have in place, regulations, space standards, market forces in planning, aren't currently preventing spaces like that being built. They've allowed it to happen. And increasingly, guidance recognizes the problem of long windowless corridors, but then sometimes only aims to reduce the number of units per core. But when circulation is designed like this, it almost doesn't matter whether it's 4 or 5 units or more, because it already discourages social interaction. So I'm going to say we need better protections for design. I'll boldly say that architects don't want to design spaces like that, and plenty of great architects already avoid doing it. But I'm going to try and force the issue in another way. And I think one way might be that we protect people's rights to good design in the same way that we protect their rights to safety, through enforceable rules. And they should be simple and unambiguous. So I'm putting forward 3 rules for circulation, for discussion. So one is the stop and chat rule, and that says that spaces should be decent enough to stop for a brief chat. And that means shared circulation must satisfy one of the following conditions: have daylight factor of at least 1%, or be external, or have a direct line of sight between the front doors and the stair and lift. So that's not possible anymore. But this is, or this, or this, or this. And if you don't have natural light or natural ventilation, then that circulation space has to be kept small or simple in shape. And the second rule is the muddy boots rule. And this one protects your right to have a better connection to the outside and arrive at your door with mud on your shoes. So that's shared circulation spaces must have washable, external grade floor surfaces, no carpets. So this is possible, and this is possible, or this. And the third rule is the place to sit rule, which means that the brief chat can turn into a longer chat and can be more inclusive or involve a cup of tea. So that's shared circulation spaces must have at least one naturally lit, furnishable area for residents to sit. So this is possible, that we've already seen, and this. And people will say that miserable corridors exist because of fire safety. It's not true. They'll say the numbers don't stack up unless you use internal corridors. That's also not true. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to find so many examples of good public housing projects. People say it limits the number of units per core. It actually doesn't. You can still fit lots of units per core and meet all those rules. They aren't constraining, they're enabling. So that's my proposal. The next government should protect design, because design is not a nice to have. It ties into other crises of global heating, cost of living, mental health, loneliness, building maintenance, and social care. It fundamentally impacts our physical and mental health, how often we see our neighbours, and how likely we are to make connections. Thank you.
Well, I'm really inspired by that, and I would be, because I live off a 125-metre long corridor, and we do stop and chat in it. Right, now I'd like to introduce Annalie Riches, who's co-founder of Mikhail Riches, Sterling winners in 2019 for their passive house scheme for Norwich City Council.
Hi. I'm proposing passive house as a minimum standard for all new homes. We've worked on quite a few now. It's not that difficult, and they're doing this in other countries. They're doing it in Scotland. Why can't we? If we look at the state of new housing developments in the UK, it's overwhelmingly mediocre. These are the findings of the UCL UK housing audit. Interestingly, there's seemingly some good news in terms of environmental performance, perhaps demonstrating that building regulations have more impact on quality than planning. However, they acknowledge the persistent performance gap that needs to be applied to all these figures. The performance gap varies vastly and depends on build quality, but it's estimated to add an additional 40% to energy use, which means that nearly all UK housing fails the building regulations. What Passive House does is it virtually eliminates this performance gap, and that is through its processes and monitoring. So what's Passive House? It's essentially a quality assurance scheme. It has 6 main ingredients. Airtightness requirements are about 1/10 of current building regulations. They're better insulated. They calculate passive solar gain in winter and overheating risk in summer. And mechanical ventilation is required to make it all work. And the details are modelled thermally to prevent cold bridging. There's a very simple target for Passive House. You need to achieve 15 kilowatts per metre squared per year for heating and cooling. So why should we do it? There are lots of reasons. The first is carbon. As you can see, it saves around 500 tonnes of CO2 over a 30-year period. It uses so little energy that it's zero carbon ready, meaning it doesn't need to be retrofitted to achieve zero carbon targets. You just add some PVs and an Essel's heat pump. As a result, fuel bills are very low. It's hard to keep track of fuel bills at the moment, but in 2019, the average fuel bill in Goldsmith Street was £70 a year, and half of that was the standing charge. Some residents report in 3 years they've not actually turned the heating on. The knock-on effect of that is that residents have been lifted out of fuel poverty. We've heard they've cleared debts and are no longer reliant on food banks. So these weren't actually the main reasons why our client wanted to do a Passive House scheme. They'd visited a housing project by Haster Housing, also in Norfolk, where a number of homes have been built to Passive House standard and a number to building regulations. And they talked to all the residents and were blown away by what they heard in terms of improved health and well-being. Haster themselves reported that Passive House homes needed much less maintenance, and there had been no evictions from the Passive House homes because residents were able to afford the rent. There were financial reasons for a local authority to choose to do Passive House. And we've heard similar stories from the Goldsmith Street residents. We were really interested in these additional potential benefits of Passive House and decided to carry out our own research. We sent surveys to all the residents. Unfortunately, only 10% replied, but of those that did, a third reported improvements in health, which included improvements to respiratory illness, less medication requirements, improved sleep, reduced anxiety. So why aren't we all built into the standard? Well, the answer I'm frequently given is cost. It's true, Passive House does cost more. The Passive House Trust has done a lot of research on this, and they estimate it adds an additional £115 per square metre, or 8% of the construction cost. Interestingly, costs come down due to experience. So the experience of the design team and delivery teams do start to reduce costs, as can be seen in the case of Exeter, who've been doing this for 10 years. The Passive House Trust believe if Passive House became mandatory, this would continue to decline the amount spent on each, and the increase in construction costs would be 4%. So are people willing to pay more for Passive House? There's not really enough data on this. Most Passive House schemes are for rent because it's the landlords that can see its benefits. The only scheme we know where it's been possible to compare it is the 3-score development in Norwich by Norwich City Council, where they made Some of the homes passive house. They applied a 5% uplift in value compared with the building regulations houses, and they sold first, so suggesting they might have undervalued them. But really, I mean, I think if you totted up the real costs of this mediocre housing, if you looked at the fuel, the healthcare, the future retrofit, the maintenance, you would find that we can't afford not to do this. Okay.
That's pretty clear from Annalie. So our third speaker on the what of public housing is Mellis Haward, who's co-founder of Archio, and they're making their name in community-led and retrofit projects. And Mellis is running to the stage now.
I was just sitting back. I thought I was on much later, but here I am. Thank you so much, Claire. It's so exciting to be here. That's me. Great. On Monday this week, the English Housing Ombudsman reported that 380,000 households out of the 4 million social housing homes in the UK are classed as non-decent. That's 1 in every 10 social housing homes in the UK. And within those numbers, 88,000 households are believed by the regulator to be living with serious damp and mould problems which can cause illness and death. We are in a dual housing crisis. Obviously, we've talked about the housing crisis due to the lack of new homes, but it's a really deep and serious crisis in the quality of existing homes. And I wanted to speak tonight to say that in our pursuit of new housing targets, we can't ignore this urgent imperative to improve the UK's ageing social housing. We really need to provide decent, warmer, healthier homes and protect residents against a deepening fuel poverty and a changing climate. And that's without even mentioning the vital need to reduce emissions. As Claire mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the government, they really need to refocus their current sporadic and piecemeal funding of retrofit programs and take a strategic, holistic view to invest in neighbourhood-level retrofit. And I'm going to make a short proposal about how it could be done. So here's a street. It represents the 1.1 million interwar homes in the UK. It's the kind of suburban housing that's generally considered the kind of lowest hanging fruit in terms of thermal retrofit. The homes were built in the 1940s, returning from war heroes, and are now leaking heat, they're damp and they're mouldy. And here's a family of homeowners. They want to improve their leaky, mouldy house, but they can't afford the works and they don't know where to start. And nationwide surveys back that up, that cost and lack of knowledge and guidance are key blockers to retrofit. And here's a local authority asset manager. She's responsible for maintaining a program of 30,000 homes, including those 3 on the street. Now, you might have heard of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund that was released a couple of years ago. The issue for her is that the money's only allocated to capital spend, i.e. stuff, i.e. insulation. And it needs to be spent in just a few months, and it's capped to only address some of the homes, only those homes that are lower than EPC rating C, which means that even if she gets grant, she can only use that grant in a sort of pepper-potted way around her all the social housing homes she's responsible for. What she really needs, I have to say that the lovely Claire in my office I didn't really ask her to draw that to look like me, but it does look like me. What she needs is a retrofit design plan to avoid the failure of piecemeal interventions in the past. And in fact, what everyone needs is a retrofit coordinator to create designs specific to their home. But how could we ever afford that? Never. So to make this work, what we require is a government with a bold vision to solve retrofit at scale. They need to refocus their disparate, short-lived funding pots, such as the Great British Insulation Scheme, which so excitingly is reported to be on course to take 67 years to hit its target. They also need to move away from this narrow-minded approach of only funding stuff. We don't just need to slap insulation on buildings. And they really need to invest in boosting supply chain skills and specifically in archetype designs, which could benefit the whole neighbourhood. And by which I mean a typical design for a typical house that can be widely applied, and what's really important, it could be applied irrespective of tenure. So for our local authority asset manager, as the government's current funding is so predominantly grant-based, at the moment she has absolutely no certainty that she'll win funding next year or the following year. So she has no ability to plan long-term strategic work and no way to justify to recruit talented people. It's really impacting vital retrofit skills at a regional level. This stop-start funding process is killing the demand-led nature of the skills. We absolutely need the government to kickstart the process of social housing retrofit at scale. A lot of the talk in the sector is about private finance and pension funds, but how on earth are they going to join the sector if the local authority can't start it first? So different tenures will need different funding models, but providing a tenure-blind archetype solution could result in a streamlined supply chain, greatly reducing upfront costs. And if we're able to get private finance involved, this could enable householders not to even have to pay upfront for their retrofit works. That's because residents could be seeing their bills reduced so substantially, as Annalie mentioned, and they can pay as they save, using the energy bill saving to gradually pay off a long-term loan. And just as an aside, can we please slash the VAT rate for energy-reducing retrofit? So back to the asset manager. In this scenario, she's equipped with an archetype retrofit design for her area, thousands of homes in one neighbourhood. Imagine if her local authority could also build on this work, perhaps provide a one-stop shop service linking accurate whole-house retrofit designs with a local supply chain and local customers. And why should we do all this? Just to reiterate the obvious, increasing in local jobs, reducing NHS bills. I think year on year, 2 billion is the average that poor housing is estimated to cost the NHS. Improved health and well-being. I remember at the beginning I said there were 380,000 homes which don't even comply with the decent home standards. And of course, a huge reduction in carbon emissions. Now, a bold, holistic neighbourhood-level approach, which I'm advocating for, will also have the cross-benefit of building collective community capacity, giving financial power to communities to transform their homes and neighbourhoods for the better. And at Archio, we're really proud to have piloted this process with local authorities such as Be First, working directly with residents, including on the retrofit design guide for the Becontree estate, which with 29,000 homes is the largest social housing estate in Europe. And also more recently with a housing association in the Midlands, where we're on site with 91 steel frame houses, all being retrofitted to accordance to PAS 2035. I just want to apologise if anyone expected me to talk about Community Land Trust, because I'm really, really proud of the project we worked on, the London Community Land Trust Citizens House. It was completed last year. And I'd love to take some questions, and I'm also maybe a bit embarrassed that this isn't architecture with a capital A. But I really, really wanted to highlight this vital issue because architects are strategic thinkers, and I foresee that we are all going to be a really crucial part of this process. And ultimately, we need to work together in our industry to find solutions for the most important issues in our society.
Thank you.
Fantastic, Mellis, thank you. And finally, so we're in the home stretch now, everybody. You get your questions ready, please, and your observations and your better ideas, if you have them. Our last three speakers are going to deal with a bit more of the how. It's my pleasure, first of all, to introduce Osama Shoush from Southwark Construction, which is the London Borough of Southwark's wholly owned construction company. Osama.
Hi, everyone. That's me. I'm from the council, so my slides are a bit less fancy than everybody else's. This is one of the developments that Southwark Construction has recently completed. So, as Claire said, Southwark Construction is the internal house building part of Southwark Council. We're there to try to build as many council houses as we possibly can, but also to try to upskill the council as we do it. I thought, start with a big question. Why is there a housing crisis? There's lots of reasons, but I think this is the biggest reason. If you look along the bottom in purple, that is the number of homes built by private developers in England since 1949. The grey segment in the middle is the number of homes built by housing associations, and the big pink section in the first half of the graph is the number of homes built by local authorities. And you can see up until about 1980, they were building between 100 and 200,000 homes a year. And then that suddenly drops off, and we're now at the tiny little, barely perceptible pink sliver at the top. So I want to zoom in on the last 10 years-ish, and you can see the homes started by local authorities in England, and that's the pink line along the top. So we are building about 1% of what we used to build. It's going up, it is trending up. And what I've done at the bottom is I've put a purple line of this is the number of council homes Southwark Council has started over that same period. I joined Southwark Council in 2020. That's when the line starts to go up. Is it a coincidence? Yeah, it's probably a coincidence. I can't take all the credit for it. So why is council housing good? A lot of the other speakers have already touched on this, but it keeps communities together, leads to better education outcomes, improves health, benefits the local economy, reduces spend on housing benefit, reduces spend on criminal justice system. It's the only type of new housing that is actually affordable to people on the median household income in London. And I think council housing is incredibly important because local authorities are most invested in the long-term future of their places. This is backed up by research, and it's backed up by our residents when we talk to them when they moved into their new homes. So why aren't we building more council homes? This is why. I'll put some numbers to this to make it easy to understand. All in, it costs us around about £400,000 to build a council house at the moment. It's expensive. We get about 30 to 50% of that as grant from the GLA. So we get between £100,000 and £200,000. Capitalised rent, which is our assumptions on the long-term rental income we get from those properties minus the management and maintenance cost, is about £75,000. So that's about 19% of the cost of building a new council house. That leaves a funding gap of between 31 to 51%. So between £125,000 and £225,000 we can't fund when we build new council houses. So what do we do to fill the gap? There's two options. One is cross-subsidy. That's building private homes on council land to try to make up the difference. But the maths doesn't quite work because even if you were to build 50% private homes, that means you need each home to generate between £125,000 and £225,000 profit to plug the gap in the cost of building a council house. And it also means the permanent loss of public land. The other option is borrowing money, but basically that means using other council residents' rent to pay off the debt on the new homes we build, and it means less money for repairs, improvements, and housing management. In reality, we do a bit of both, really. We borrow and we do cross-subsidy, but neither works perfectly. So what could be done about it? In the short term, councils like Southwark sit on pots of money that we've got from the right to buy sale of our council houses, but we can't use that money at the same time that we use our GLA grant. So we've got pots of money we can't spend to build council housing. If that rule was changed, it wouldn't solve the housing crisis, but it would mean we could keep building and we'd be able to build more. Then longer term, and this has also been touched on, between 21-22 and 25-26, the government will spend £58 billion on housing benefit. During the same period, it will spend about £11.5 billion on building affordable housing. So it's 5 times more on a short-term solution than on a longer-term solution. And if we could rebalance that ratio, it would mean we could build so many more council homes. And then always, I think we need to remember that council housing is part of a joined-up system that improves families' lives, and it is the most meaningful intervention the state can make. Thanks.
Straight from the horse's mouth. Fantastic. And now Paul Karakusevic, who's founder of Karakusevic, Carson Architects, and they specialise in improving the quality of public housing in the UK. Thanks, Paul.
I'm going to be very quick because everyone else's stopwatches were broken. So it's going to be 4 minutes. And included in that is a 1-minute history lesson for the students in the room on the history of housing. I think we've got a problem. We've, as a practice, been looking at community, social, public, council housing for 25 years. Pooja was right. We've had 25 ministers in that time. It's accelerating. Hopefully, governmental change may bring something new to that regular exchange of ministers. Some lovely quotes here from the 50s. I won't read them, you can read them. But incredible characters who set the compass 75 years ago. And then a more recent quote, which I thought was lovely from The Guardian, from Kenyon Malik, deeply political, and you can see the results. You walk onto any council estate, any deprived neighbourhood, you can see the issues. I think I'm going to talk about two main things. I think numbers. Since 1919, there were some remarkable things in the Addison Act, post First World War. But for the last 105 years, if you take out 5 years for the Second World War, we've had 100 years of an official housing crisis, and every year people are talking about numbers. Unfortunately, numbers lead to tax incentives, lead to contractor-led poor quality, panelized systems, and you can see nationwide what happens 15, 20, 25 years later when people only focus on the numbers rather than quality. For the youngsters in the room, some rogues, recent and less recent, but all of these prime ministers and their teams have really neglected public and social housing. There were some moments with the Blair-Brown government to start funding. Unfortunately, some of those were squashed by Cameron and Osborne. Again, if you don't fund it, you have the problems like this, poor construction, overcrowding, homelessness, endemic sort of levels, design and build, poor quality design, poor quality construction, and damp and mold. Again, all everywhere in the press at the moment. It's an absolute tragedy. So I think this is a denial, disinterest, and a broken system. As an illustration, I think that one of the key things we can all do is in the room as designers, practitioners, and architects is to add our clarity, our capacity to draw diagrams, good plans, good sections. This is a diagram of how Osama and the GLA and others receive their funding. I don't think anyone could design a more complicated way of delivering public and social housing. So I think we do have a real problem. It took us about a week and a half to work this out. I'm not if there are any housing economists in the room, please, any further suggestions, or if we are totally wrong on this, please let us know. But we think it's a good guess. In contrast, a little bit of history here. Some amazing people, 120 years ago, who started to look at the poverty, look at the low-grade conditions that people were living in. And I think we need that Abercrombie and Forsyth moment again to change things. Sort of mission driven. Somebody mentioned Mariana Mazzucato. It's absolutely this is what the public sector can do incredibly well. Elizabeth Denby, who had a lecture last night about her remarkable work. Everyone, again, the youngsters in the room should look her up. Rosemary Schoenstedt, remarkable projects in West London, Roehampton, and also in North London, Highbury. If you live around here, you can go and see them. Purpose, we have a young Kate on the left. The LCC, obviously building the first council homes ever, Addison and Nye Bevan. And this is what it creates. If you have vision, you're working together, you leave a legacy, create dignity for the residents. And you saw this phrase earlier in Pooja's. We should have probably coordinated more. We didn't, but I really see it's time for a reset. I'm normally a slightly ground-up, resident-led, council-led type of guy. That's what we've been doing for 25 years. But in thinking about the issues that we all face, the sector faces, I think this is the only, in 105 years, there has never been a public housing minister. And I think if you look at all of the issues we've all been discussing, I think it has to come from the top. Having, at the moment, the housing minister has 16 to 18 responsibilities. Clearly, affordable housing is in there somewhere, but with levelling up, with keeping the house builders happy, with planning and everything else, we need a dedicated minister. So it would normally be an elevator pitch, but it's going to be a pitch in one of Astrid's lovely galleries. So in 2 minutes, I think this should probably go to the Prime Minister rather than the Housing Minister, but I think a dedicated person leading this could start to restore quality with a nationwide remit, with a 50-year plan. Forget these 3-5-year targets. It's crazy. We know it doesn't work. Public housing has to be seen as critical infrastructure. There's a National Infrastructure Commission. It hasn't dealt with housing. It hasn't touched social housing, I think, again, and that's a real mistake. It has to be seen nationwide so quality can be maintained. We have to look at public land. Russell started with the golf courses. For 25 years, we've been looking at rail, NHS, tube, other public underutilised assets. Hundreds of thousands of homes could be there. There's been NHS housing czars. They've delivered about 5 homes in 20 years. So this is why it has to be top down. Championing, looking at design quality. We're all architects. We love design. We love materiality. We love craft. We need to be given the tools and the funding to do that. Key are obviously the regions, the devolved cities, obviously the GLA. I think 1 or 2 people from the GLA here, and local authorities. And if we build homes through MMC, cheap materials, we will be pulling them down in 20 to 30 years, regardless of what any manufacturer says. So I think we really have to look at homes. We design homes carefully, we build them carefully, we maintain them properly, and we create this 300-year legacy, which I think comes down to building a little bit less, not focusing in on numbers, and just a very simple diagram of how the ministry could work and how it can then collaborate and help the regions and the local authorities. I think architects, in Spain, there is an architectural minister, which I think is amazing, to look at quality, design, standards. I think we could probably do, maybe add another ministry that looks at that as well. I think city architects are absolutely key, and borough architects to set the compass, ambition, work with communities and manage the process. We all know procurement is totally crazy in many instances, and I think architects can cut through some of that red tape and design a much better system. So let's aim for better, a bit less, and I think examples here of just a few from the last decade, where we've worked carefully with residents and councils, I think, to deliver some really good public housing, council housing, with dignity, quality, longevity, and a couple on the drawing board at the moment, Broadwater Farm and the Ledbury Estate in Southwark for Osama and team. So it's great to be here. This was the Let Us Face the Future from 1945. I think it's definitely time. Quality matters and public housing works. Thank you very much.
And we have our final speaker coming onto stage now. Very, very honoured to introduce Kate McIntosh, who designed some fantastically groundbreaking housing.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Well, I'm going to speak quite politically here. A Labour government, assuming coming to power in this country, a country riven by years of divisive hate propaganda, with a crisis in health, housing and education, will want some quick headline-grabbing fixes. It will be tempting for them to reach for the instant gratification followed by 30 years of remorse of PFI and PPP, which generated much of the funding morass in which the NHS now flounders. Instead of repeating the mistakes of the Blair government, committed within a national context of greater consensus and lesser inequality, they would do well to look further back to the post-World War II government, when Nye Bevan was Minister for both Health and Housing, the link between which two basic needs was universally recognised. A quick hit, rather than replicating the Tory mantra of blaming the planning system for the shortages of affordable housing, would be to focus on the 1.1 million and rising unimplemented consents for houses on sites which volume house builders are hoarding, and to tax that land at its existing as approved value. This would pressurize developers into building out. And if they fail to respond, compulsory purchase at the value before consent would be justified. Such sites could then be allocated to the Community Land Trust, encouraging cooperative house builders, a sector which in Europe contributes roughly a third of new build housing, serving mixed communities. And there is an enormous suppressed demand for cooperative housing in this country, held back because people can't negotiate for sites. They have to be able to move quickly, which of course the developers can. In Vienna, regularly voted the world's most livable city, much of the land is under public ownership or held by cooperatives, reducing the inflationary pressure and making housing affordable. And 60% of the Viennese population lives in subsidized rented accommodation, no stigma attached. The level of the subsidy is adjusted for the income of the resident. Labour's announced intent to build new towns and weaken the greenfield belt protection is no doubt causing a flurry of speculative activity, scanning the country in search of agricultural land close to highways or to rail networks, in expectation of the making of a killing with an uplift by a multiple of as much as 275 through consent for change of use. Such unearned windfalls should be captured for community benefit, as would happen under a land value taxation as applied, if it were applied. LVT is currently implemented throughout Denmark, Estonia, Lithuania, Singapore, and in Pennsylvania. And wherever it is applied, it constrains land hoarding and social inequalities are reduced. The 1975 Loeb government adopted a weaker version of LVT with a land betterment levy abandoned by the Conservatives in 1951 under Churchill, who had advocated land betterment taxation in 1909, in his days as a Liberal MP. Right to buy, of course, should be scrapped, as it was in Scotland in 2016 and in Wales in 2019. and the equalisation of VAT across retrofit and new build housing would eliminate the 20% incentive for site clearings, allowing a genuine cost-benefit analysis. Now, this slide you've seen a version of before, but what is added in this iteration is the effect of the cutting off of the virtual stoppage of social house building on the house prices. That's the continuous black line that you see. In 2013, Brett Christopher published his research in the privatisation of UK public estate following the 1979 election, which of course is when social housing ground to a halt. Roughly 50% of that public asset has been sold off at that time, and no doubt this proportion has increased since, driven by the average reduction in the government block grant to local authorities of, I thought it was 40%, but we've heard earlier that it was 43%. And this percent, which is an average, varies perversely, reducing the allocation in the more needy authorities, thus forcing administrations to raise finance by selling off their assets. Data shows that more than 1 million properties across England in 2022 were unoccupied. That's over 4% of all dwellings, an increase of nearly 60,000 homes in 4 years. Do we really have a housing crisis? Or is it not better diagnosed as a crisis of maldistribution through hoarding, buy to leave, asset boxes, deliberate neglect of the existing stock, and unaffordability? In Scotland, a levy is raised, or can be raised by the local authority against such empty properties. Many regard the level at which this is placed as too low, but the principle, I would suggest, is sound. And as has earlier been pointed out, the effect of this privatisation and reliance on the private landlord is that as a proportion of GDP of all the countries in Europe, we pay out the highest percent in housing benefit. But notwithstanding, that is not sufficient to cover the rent that the private landlords wish to extort. And consequently, of course, you've got no-fault evictions and the scandalous neglect of properties leading to health crises. Thank you.
Kate, stay on stage, Kate. And if I could ask the rest of the panel to come and join Kate and myself, that would be fantastic. You'd probably note, whilst you're thinking about your questions, and we've got, about 25 minutes for them, and we're going to come straight to them, you'll probably notice two absences, economists and the private sector. So I've got, if there's any private sector people or economists out there, I've got two questions for you. The first one is, London can't be Vienna because we can't just overnight increase wages, devalue land and property, change property taxes, and stop housing benefit. So what is a policymaker in London supposed to do? Very difficult question, that one. And if there's anyone out there from the private sector who's delivering, developers, investors, what is your role in this? Is Kate right that actually the private sector, PFI, whatever you want to call it, shouldn't be involved necessarily in affordable housing? Or do they have a fantastic role to play? And if so, what is that? So I'm going to ask one question quickly to the panel, if I can find it, which is, let's say we're awash with money. That minister has given you billions. It's still not easy to do, is it? What is then the key challenge to delivering a lot more affordable? Is it land, Russell? Is it planning, Pooja? Is it the fact that the industry's not ready? Is it NIMBYs? What's the biggest thing that, if the minister did find loads of money, would still be a problem? Anybody want to start? There are mics somewhere. You're probably sitting on them. Osama.
It would still take time. Building good housing means working with great architects. It means spending a lot of time talking to the community and working with them on what kind of homes they want. I think it's difficult because where I work, money is the problem. So if we had lots of money, I think we would make a massive, meaningful change. But no change would happen overnight. And I think it would be a mistake to try to rush that.
Joe?
I think it's interesting that recently there was an article that like billions of affordable housing grant went back to central government because local authorities were unable to draw that funding down. And therefore, I think that like this idea that just throwing money at a structure that doesn't work is the answer. So I think that's where I'm like, you have to reconstruct the land that you're throwing money into. So it's like you're trying to grow plants out of a field that's like totally scorched. And I think until you vitalize that, like, this is a bad metaphor, but if you I don't know, any landscape gardeners in here? If you like re-sow the land, with like nurture it, and then you can grow it. And I think this idea, we always think that like the output is the solution and not the process by which we do things. And I think there's like so many other tools of democracy we just don't apply, like citizens' assemblies. Like, well, someone said to me, like, politics is done by the people you least want to do it. So like, I'm kind of interested in like a jury service for like looking at policy and looking at plans. So you get a letter in the mail, you now have been selected for citizens' assembly. Part of your duty is to think about this with your peers, how this happens, like golf courses. Imagine if that was devolved to a citizens' assembly in every borough of London. I think that idea, the mechanism by which you get there, still is a thing that hasn't been designed. And I think throwing money at stuff is just such a waste of time.
I think what's the point? I didn't catch that.
Don't worry about it.
Okay, fine.
Did you, Pooja?
It's too many of us, isn't it? Yeah, I think it's about a cultural shift, and that's what I really believe in, is what we see the role of local government to be in, building on Kate's point. So you can put in loads of money, but everything we know from what we do is that actually the biggest barrier that local authorities face is actually finding the right people and the right skills. But for me, there's a capability aspect here around the confidence and the role that local authority believes they have to actually deal with this crisis. So it's fundamentally about shifting that from being super reactive to being like, okay, we've got the money, but how do we fundamentally change the ability to solve this crisis?
How do you suddenly create a public sector and local authorities that do have that confidence? I mean, literally, what would you go out and do tomorrow to make that happen?
Employ everyone in this room.
Okay, fantastic. Russell?
We do have it's funny you said capability. I also think there's a massive capability gap, but we have a capability gap in the construction sector as well. We have huge problem. Well, I mean, we all know, it's been touched on by Paul earlier, that we just build really, really badly, and it's heartbreaking. And we don't yet have a means. I don't think we're lacking skills, we're lacking capability, we're lacking capacity. Brexit's a big part of that, but we've lost the knowledge, I think, to build things well, and we need to get a lot better at that. And that's not something that you can fix overnight.
Okay, I'm going to go out to the room now. If you're an economist or a private sector investor or a developer, great. If you're not, great as well. It's quite hard to see from here. I've got somebody in a red jumper sitting there. Can the microphone please go to the gentleman sitting in the middle? Ladies, you can ask questions as well, don't forget.
Hi, good evening. Thank you all for the lecture. I would actually like, can you hear me?
Yes.
I would like to ask a question to the moderator, to talk with Kate McIntosh. The thing that you said in the beginning of your intervention, now that is not possible. I wonder why, because I'm not I'm not a British citizen, but I read that the government decided by decree that Rwanda was a safe country, so that they could send migrants there. So by decree, they could decide that it's no longer an option for investment funds and pension funds and sovereign funds to use housing as bank deposits. So they can confiscate all that and increase the supply by tomorrow. I wonder.
Right. I don't know what your pension's worth. I think there are big structural problems with trying to kind of change something overnight. I mean, another question I have is, if Sadiq Khan said all land has to be 67% affordable, all developments have to be 67% affordable as of tomorrow, which is what they do in Vienna, then suddenly the value of land would just crash and burn, and a whole bunch of structural things would happen to sort of all of our lives. My understanding is the reason Vienna is successful is because it bought a shed load of land in the 20s and 30s, and it actually continues to do so now because it's not worth very much because you've got to put 2/3 affordable on it. So they've unspeculated their entire stock, and that's why, and they've got this huge set of people living in cooperative housing. It would be so difficult to do that overnight. And the way I think about London is, the housing market, it's like a massive tree, and you know how you have to prune trees all the time. If they get absolutely huge, they start overshadowing everything else, and it's because London has just never had the pruning done, the taxes, the boring stuff that makes the market work, and we've just got this outsized tree that's killing everyone, and it's kind of killing the city. And you can't solve that by just sort of cutting the top off, unfortunately, because the tree just dies. So it's going to be a very gradual process of change, in my view. But Kate may disagree.
I'm not sure that I heard the question correctly, but I think you were talking about the use of pension funds. There's a perverse law in this country that pension funds, including pension funds for employees of local government, they have to be invested in whatever is going to bring the best returns. Now, of course, that very often is something very socially undesirable. There's recently been a move to people who enjoy such pensions, of whom I'm one, to campaign for disinvestment from ecologically harmful activities such as drilling for oil. So that law does not exist in other countries. In Germany, for instance, our pension funds can be used for workers' housing, which obviously is of benefit, or can be of benefit to the people who are investing part of their savings in the fund. It's much more rational. But in this country where everything is commodified and neoliberal philosophy holds sway, that is not the case. Scotland which has its own legal system, a mechanism for community buyouts in cases where the owner of the land has been, they can demonstrate, not behaving responsibly and has been exploiting and abusing the community. And that has successfully led to a couple of islands being bought out. Islay is a case in point where they are now energy self-sufficient. Plenty of wind in Scotland.
Is there another question from the audience? Yeah, I've got one there. sort of near the front. Super.
Hi, thank you very much. It's not really a question, more a sort of observation. It seems to me that a lot of our problem comes from a sort of a lack of joined up thinking about our whole political structure. I mean, housing is just part of a much greater thing, which when you look at, some of your speakers have said we can't always look back, but it's really interesting that the welfare state was actually set up on the basis of the Beveridge report, which saw housing as just an integral part of health, of education, of welfare, of how our successful communities arise. And I think what we really need is very, very strong political leadership to actually say that housing should be decommodified and be seen as an essential part of our lives. It's not something which is a commodity, it's something which is as important as our health and our education, both of which have been, both very threatened, but have been part of our state services. And I think we should be, as Paul says, actually looking at both either a Ministry of Housing or a new National Housing Service, a new NHS, which actually should look at housing not as something which is just something which can be commodified and increase in value, but is our actual national right. But this requires a really, really big change in political thinking, a deep shift, I think. And I think until we start seeing it that way, as long as we keep seeing it as this sort of particularized part of our life, as architecture or a part of a land or developer's thing, then we're always going to fail.
Can I come back on that?
Of course you can.
Sorry. But I think that we talk about political leadership as like we want these individuals to come along and like unlock like a public consciousness. But actually I'm interested in like public leadership. And actually like the reason why I think you don't see that change is because the housing crisis is a conspiracy that so many people are playing a part of. Because it's in my interest as someone whose parents own a home that value maintains, because I will not be able to buy a home unless I can leverage the equity in that home. Because I will never earn enough. So I think there's a collective conspiracy from people who are most politically active to maintain the status quo the way that it is. Which is why I'm so interested in unlocking a wider public engagement in this. And I think that having been at Harvard, where like political leadership is the individual, the sovereign individual, and that's where like people like Ted Cruz and like Jared Kushner and all these people spell out of these like, PPE courses where like you as an individual political leader have this like innate or like higher ability to transform the lives of others. And I think actually the real game is how do we get more people to feel like they have a stake in like leadership. And actually we don't talk about leadership, we just talk about collective action. And actually like if we actually as a public demanded it, it would change. But we don't demand it because a lot of our family wealth, like access to equity, is locked in this conspiracy. And a lot of the people who are most poorly affected by it also are not the people who are like enfranchised to vote or to be part of the political system, because it's difficult, because it takes time. If you work in 3 jobs, how are you going to actively participate in a political system that requires time commitments?
Do you think, Joe and others, that it's almost as simple as there's a generation, and it will probably just not be there in 20 to 25 years, that just vote and own everything, and that the whole thing's just going to shift?
Well, yes, and we're coming. I wanted to comment on what this model could be, and maybe it's an opportunity to talk about community land trusts as maybe the other way to home ownership that's seen as an asset. And the project we worked on, it came from the community. It was not a developer's idea or a politician's idea. It was the community looking at themselves and saying, we have a crisis that my child's school teacher can't afford to live in this borough. So this is in Lewisham. So she lives in Southend-on-Sea. So it's a really physical manifestation of
CLTs are an absolute beast. Actually trying to do those schemes that you've done and others have done takes the most fun. You're nearly dead by the time you finish.
I mean, I'm only 41, so it's okay. But we started the project. We started the project 6.5 years ago, and that was at the point where the land was gifted from the council. So it took ages. But I was really in 2 minds what to talk about tonight, because I think community land trusts are an amazing model where, for those who don't know, the homes are sold in relation to local earnings. It's totally detached from market level sales. And the homes in this case were sold at 65% of an equivalent home. So you're really making a fundamental difference to somebody's ability to buy a home. But I have lost my train of thought. But I think that what we proved in that scheme is that it is possible, even in an inner London site. And I think that Kate's point, where land is being held by developers, and may I also say sometimes local authorities who don't have the capacity to build sites, how about after 5 years, the option is given to the community to take that on board? I agree. Yeah, thank you. Great. Woo. Oh, I should have spoken about that. Anyway, but I didn't want to talk about it because it is a long-term, difficult solution, and it involves so much community time and time on the ground. But maybe, yeah, we just need to wait for all the old people to die, and then it'll be fine.
Right, we've got 10 minutes. I'd like 2 more questions. Right, I've got one on the balcony who's waving frantically. You're going to have to shout your head off. Great.
Where to start? I'm not a lot happy with this.
Welcome.
All of the lights are the X's, Aguilers, Maces, the idea. Also talk to all topics and messages so that you can come all the way to your side.
So if you had to persuade Gen Xers, boomers, etc., to really do what Louise was talking about and just kind of refocus investment into housing, what's the sell to them? They're all right, thanks.
I would say my sell would be, if you continue to see disintegration of our public realm, people will come and they will take your shit from your house.
I think also it's like their children are going to be affected. I think it's no longer and so easily separable that there's this group that are completely unaffected because they're finding that their children and their grandchildren are going to be in trouble. And I think maybe that's how we're going to have to start to address it.
I mentioned Brexit earlier. That demographic largely voted for Brexit. Families are not forming because the homes aren't there for them to form into. There's a population crisis coming. That generation is going to get old. They're going to go into homes. There's going to be nobody to look after them.
This is getting really serious.
Yours is weaker than mine because I'm saying they will take your shit, and you're saying you're going to leave them in their shit.
I'm sure that everyone here must be aware of the latest Roundtree report, which shows that about 10% of the population live in absolute poverty, and that in order to raise themselves out of that poverty, they would have to more than double their income. Now, this level of inequality across the country is second only to what you get in the United States. It breeds hatred, it breeds resentment, it breeds every sort of social ill, as was very thoroughly researched in spirit level by Follett and Wilkinson, comparing Britain with all the other democracies across the world. And it showed that every sort of social ill is exacerbated by inequality. So if you want a harmonious society, a society where you don't get knife crime and homicides on a daily basis, you have to have a more equitable society. And to achieve that, you've got to give a level of decent housing to everyone.
Thanks, Kate. Really quick one, because then I'm going to take one more. Go.
No, great. Can I just, because, I mean, you mentioned that CLTs and the stuff takes ages and it's a kind of typical characterization. I would say that those big, massive schemes also take ages and they're really fragile. They're really, they take ages to get. Meridian Water fell apart for some reason. And while they're doing that, they blight the land they're on. So actually going to a smaller scale, there's capacity, where we're looking for capacity, we know the limits on capacity, but where there is capacity is in the demand, as in the skills of people, residents who want housing. So by going down to a scale of a CLT, you actually got an unused capacity there, and that same site divided into smaller parcels, developed in smaller projects, would get going with more resilience and speed.
Great, and I think I've got some horrible private money down in the front here that wants to talk. The microphone to do so.
Thanks, Claire. So, since you asked, and I think I got invited for this purpose, so I can be moments later in the foyer. I'm not really sure if I got a question. It's just some observations. You've asked for some comments about the private sector, and maybe a bit like Pooja was saying, getting better people into the local authority, and you could argue what is better. I believe you're doing that, and I believe as a journey we need to get more of us into the private sector client side, because I think we can actually change a lot from being within those organisations. I've been on a bit of a journey, private equity, that's the really bad money, through to my current, where I spend half my life currently with Igloo Regeneration, which is better money with principles, but still operating in that residual land value model. And that's, a problem, and Kate's put it quite clearly around, the opportunities that other countries have taken with land value tax. There's no surprise to when I read recently that I think the Vikings were welcomed into Britain because they gave everybody land, because it gave them an opportunity to have meaningful, make a meaningful contribution, but be productive. And if they're not productive on that land and they still have to pay tax on it, then it forces them to give up that land. So in a sense, it's giving everybody the same opportunity. And this conversation around publicness, etc., is that everybody doesn't have the same opportunity. And we've got this very polarised model out there, which is actually driving a lot of the problems that we face. So I was shocked and saddened that Keir Starmer said, came out in pro-home ownership, because in a way, the exam question you've asked is where should public housing go next? In a sense, kill home ownership is where it should go next, because that's one of the things that's fueling the economy, the land economy, how much it costs to build stuff. Everybody's taking their pound of flesh and doing work in joint venture with local authorities. We still have to buy stuff from the same supply chain, and the procurement rules they wrap themselves up in which case they can only buy from huge companies, means all the money is going in a very singular direction. So we talk about scaling down and being able to deliver, as Adam was saying, at a more nimble scale. And we would love to do that, but you can't get the money, or you can't get the procurement rules with local authorities to do it. So we've got situations in the north of England, and I won't really want to put people on the spot, where those cities have got zero land value, and they say, right, we're going to put money in because we don't have a functioning housing market, so we're going to prime it ourselves and do all this stuff. And I'm like, what, you think that there's a functioning housing market in the south that you're trying to copy? You've got this amazing opportunity to shift the dial because they own the land and they're going to give it away, and that fuels the problem.
Very sadly, we're out of time. I just want to say 4 things. I've heard some really amazing, inspiring sentences tonight. The stop and chat rule, I absolutely love. Make a just city justly. The absence of design is a public health issue. And kill home ownership. I think we can all get behind quite a lot of that. I'd like to thank our 10 speakers. I'd like to thank Mike Althorpe at Karakusevic, Carson, for putting together the fantastic public housing handouts that you've no doubt been perusing, and also Ellis Woodman at the Architecture Foundation for collecting us all here tonight. Good night, everybody.